The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. "My mother, she needs $50,000. Elias watched his wife's face. Naima, who commanded boardrooms with a glance, whose voice could silence a room of powerful men, did not so much as blink. Her expression remained a placid lake, betraying nothing of the currents that might be churning beneath. She simply held his gaze, her deep brown skin luminous even in the soft lamplight of their living room. This room, his room, still felt more his than theirs, filled with the worn-out comfort of his old life, a life before her. He felt a tremor of shame in his gut. This was a test. A foolish, ugly test born from a fear he couldn't name. A fear that whispered to him in the dead of night, telling him this couldn't be real. That a woman like her, with her glass tower office and her world of impossible wealth, could not truly want a man like him. A man whose greatest assets were calloused hands and a daughter with eyes full of starlight. Naima finally broke the silence. Her voice was as controlled as ever, the crisp, precise cadence of a CEO. "I see," she said. Just that. She placed her porcelain teacup back on its saucer with a delicate click, the sound echoing the frantic beat of his heart. She stood, her movements fluid and elegant, the silk of her robe whispering against the floor. She walked toward the hallway, pulling her phone from her pocket. She didn't look back. Elias's stomach plummeted. This was it. The moment the fairy tale ended. The moment she called her lawyer, her financial advisor, her sister, someone to whom she would say, "You were right, it was always about the money." He was a fool for believing, and a bigger fool for testing the one beautiful thing that had ever happened to him since the world had fallen apart. He sank deeper into the worn armchair, the ghost of his shame a cold weight on his shoulders. He thought he knew what was about to happen. He was wrong. And from that moment, everything changed. Before Naima, Elias's world had been a small, carefully constructed universe of two, himself and Amara. His life was measured in the steady rhythm of responsibility. 5:30 a.m., the alarm would chime, a gentle melody he'd chosen so it wouldn't startle his daughter sleeping in the next room. He would move through the pre-dawn quiet of their small apartment, the floorboards groaning a familiar greeting. The scent of coffee brewing was the first layer of the day, followed shortly by the smell of sizzling turkey bacon or pancakes, depending on whether it was a Tuesday or a Friday. His daughter, Amara, was the sun around which his world spun. At 6 years old, she was a whirlwind of bright energy and startling wisdom. She'd come padding into the kitchen, her natural hair in the beaded braids he'd painstakingly learned to do from YouTube tutorials, the beads clicking softly with every step. Her eyes, the same warm brown as her late mother's, would still be soft with sleep. "Morning, Papa," she'd mumble, climbing onto her designated chair, a booster seat perched on a sturdy wooden chair he'd repaired himself. Their apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in a quiet, historically black neighborhood in Charlotte. But it was filled with warmth. Amara's drawings, vibrant explosions of color, were taped to every available surface. A paper chain they were making to count down to her birthday snaked along the living room wall. It was a home built not of expensive things, but of shared moments and unwavering love. Elias worked as a logistics coordinator for a small, family-owned furniture company. It was a steady job, one that required a sharp mind for detail and a calm head when shipments went awry. It paid the bills, it kept a roof over their heads, it allowed him to buy Amara the extra-large box of crayons with the sharpener built in. It was enough. He carried his grief for his late wife Sarah, not like a heavy coat, but like a worn-out photograph in his wallet. A private, tender ache that surfaced in quiet moments, when a certain song played on the radio, or when Amara would ask a question that started with, "Did Mama ever?" He never performed his sadness. He channeled it into being a better father. He learned to differentiate a fever from a simple cold. He learned which bedtime story was the only cure for a bad dream. He learned that love, true love, was an action. It was packing a lunch with the crusts cut off. It was sitting through a 2-hour dance recital to watch your daughter be a tree for 30 seconds. It was showing up. Always. This quiet, predictable life was his fortress. He had built its walls high to protect his heart, and more importantly, to protect Amara's. He never expected anyone to breach them. He never expected a woman who lived in a world of pure, blinding light to ever find her way into his small, candlelit corner of the universe. He wasn't looking for love. He was focused on survival, on maintaining the fragile peace he had so carefully curated from the wreckage of his past. He was a good man, a black man of quiet strength and deep integrity, who believed he had already used up his lifetime's allotment of great love. Naima's world was forged from glass and steel. Her office on the 40th floor was a minimalist masterpiece, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city she had, in many ways, conquered. She was the CEO of a revolutionary fintech company, a black woman who had shattered every ceiling placed above her, with a combination of relentless intellect and unshakable composure. Her days were a meticulously scheduled ballet of board meetings, investor calls, and strategy sessions. She moved through her life with a precision that left no room for error, or for messiness. Her penthouse apartment was much like her office, beautiful, expensive, and sterile. Art hung on the walls, chosen by a decorator for its investment value. Furniture, sleek and modern, looked as though it had never been sat on. She would often come home late, the silence of the large space pressing in on her. She would eat a meal prepared by her personal chef, a perfectly balanced plate of seared salmon and asparagus, alone at a dining table that could seat 12. She had everything success was supposed to bring. She had achieved more than her parents, with their conditional praise and their constant pressure to perform, had ever dreamed of. And yet, she was profoundly lonely. Her past was a landscape of expectations. Love had always been transactional. Her parents loved her achievements. The man she'd almost married had loved her status. No one had ever simply loved her. No one had ever looked past the CEO, past the powerhouse, to see the woman underneath who was tired of being strong, who secretly loved bad movies and burnt toast, who just wanted someone to make her a cup of tea without an agenda. She had built her own fortress, not of brick and mortar, but of tailored suits and corporate language. Her armor was impeccable. It had protected her, allowed her to thrive in hostile environments. But armor is heavy, and after a while, it can start to feel like a cage. She was respected. She was admired. She was even feared. But she was not seen. Not really. People saw her title, her wealth, her power. They saw a symbol. They didn't see the small cracks in her composure, the moments when she would stare out her office window, not at the sprawling city below, but at a small park, watching families push their children on swings, a hollow ache in her chest. She had curated a perfect life, but it was a life without warmth, without the beautiful, unpredictable chaos of real human connection. She had everything, and she had nothing at all. She had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, to be vulnerable, to simply be. Until a little girl with beaded braids and a skinned knee crashed into her perfectly ordered world. The collision of their worlds happened on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in a public park. Naima's company was sponsoring a community family fun day, a calculated act of corporate goodwill. Naima was there for the photo op. She was supposed to smile, shake hands with a few local politicians, say a few words about corporate responsibility, and leave. She was wearing a crisp white linen suit, utterly impractical for the heat, and shoes that were not made for walking on grass. She felt like an actress on a set, disconnected from the vibrant, chaotic scene around her. The air smelled of popcorn and freshly cut grass. Children were screaming with joy, their faces painted like tigers and butterflies. Elias was there with Amara. For them, it was just a Saturday, a chance to be outside, to enjoy the free bouncy castle and the ice pops. Amara, wearing a bright yellow sundress that contrasted beautifully with her rich, dark skin, was a blur of motion. She was running, her backpack bouncing, her beaded braids a colorful swirl behind her. One moment she was chasing a butterfly, The next, she was making a beeline for the face painting station. Elias watched her from a park bench, a small, contented smile on his face. This was his joy. Simple. Pure. The incident was mundane, the kind of thing that happens 1,000 times a day in parks all over the world. Amara, in her excitement, tripped over an exposed sprinkler head. It wasn't a bad fall, but it was dramatic. A sudden cry, a flash of yellow, and then tears. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his long legs covering the distance in seconds. He knelt beside her, his voice a low, calming murmur. "It's okay, sweet pea. Let Papa see. You're okay." Naima was standing nearby, preparing for her speech, when she heard the cry. Her first instinct, the CEO instinct, was to have her assistant handle it, to ensure there was no liability, no scene. But something made her pause. She saw the tall black man kneeling on the grass, his broad back to her. She saw the way he gathered the small girl into his arms, his large, capable hands so gentle as he examined a scraped knee. There was a quiet competence in his movements, an aura of unconditional love that was so palpable it seemed to shimmer in the hot afternoon air. She found herself walking toward them, her heels sinking slightly into the turf. Her assistant tried to intercept her, but she waved him off. "Is she all right?" Naima asked. Her voice sounded foreign in this setting, too formal. Elias looked up, and for the first time, Naima truly saw him. He was tall and strong, with kind eyes that were etched with a tiredness she recognized, though its source was so different from her own. His dark brown skin was glowing in the sun. He was wearing simple jeans and a pressed but faded polo shirt. He looked at her not as a CEO, not as a sponsor, not as a woman in an expensive suit, but simply as another person. "She'll be fine," he said, his voice calm and deep. "Just a little scrape, more surprise than anything." He looked back down at Amara, who was now sniffling against his shoulder. "What's the rule, sweet pea?" Amara mumbled into his shirt. "Count to 10, take a deep breath, and then we check." Naima watched, fascinated. He held his daughter, rubbing her back, his presence a shield of safety. He didn't rush her. He didn't dismiss her pain. He just held the space for her. After a moment, Amara's sobs subsided. She peeked out from her father's shoulder, and her eyes landed on Naima. "Your dress is shiny," Amara said, her voice thick with tears. Naima blinked, taken aback. She looked down at her suit. "It's linen," she said, feeling foolish. "You look like a queen," Amara declared. "A sad queen." Elias's lips twitched into a small smile. "Amara," he said gently, "that's not polite." "But it's true," the little girl insisted, her logic unassailable. "Her eyes are leaky, but not all the way." Naima felt a strange heat rise in her cheeks. The child's unfiltered observation had pierced straight through her armor. She was a sad queen. She hadn't even realized it herself until this little girl, this innocent oracle, had named it. Her assistant was hovering, trying to pull her away to the stage. But Naima didn't move. She was rooted to the spot, watching as this man, this stranger, pulled a small first aid kit from a worn backpack. He cleaned the scrape with a wipe and carefully applied a colorful cartoon bandage. The whole process was a ritual of care, efficient and tender. "All better?" he asked Amara. She nodded, her resilience absolute. "All better." She then looked at Naima again. "Do you need a bandage? For your sad eyes?" Before Naima could answer, her assistant was at her elbow, whispering urgently about the mayor's arrival. She was pulled back into her world. But as she walked away, she glanced back. The black single dad was lifting his daughter onto his shoulders, and the little girl's laughter, pure and unburdened, floated across the park. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. That night, in her silent penthouse, Naima couldn't get the image out of her head. A father's gentle hands, a child's devastating honesty. For the first time in years, she felt a crack in the perfect, lonely fortress she had built around her heart. She had been seen. Not as a CEO, but as a sad queen. And strangely, it felt like hope. Naima found a reason to see them again. It was a flimsy pretext. Her company's community outreach department needed to follow up on any incidents from the event. It was a call she could have delegated to any one of a dozen employees, but she made it herself. She found Elias's number through the event's registration list. When he answered, his voice was warm and slightly surprised. She kept her own tone professional, clipped. "This is Naima Vance from Vance Tech. I was just calling to check on your daughter, Amara." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "She's fine," Elias said. "She's been telling everyone she met a real queen who needed a bandage for her soul." Naima laughed. A real, genuine laugh that startled her. It felt rusty. "I assure you my soul is fully bandaged." The lie was thin, and they both knew it. An awkward silence followed. Then, impulsively, Naima said, "My company would like to send a small gift basket as an apology for the faulty sprinkler." "That's really not necessary," he began, but she insisted. She got his address. The gift basket that arrived was extravagant, filled with gourmet foods and expensive toys. A week later, Elias called to thank her. "Amara loves the art set," he said, "but honestly, this is too much. We can't accept all of it." "Then have dinner with me," Naima said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "As a thank you for being so gracious." The first dinner was at a neutral, upscale restaurant. It was stilted and awkward. Naima wore a power dress. Elias wore the nicest shirt he owned. They talked around their lives, two ambassadors from different planets trying to find a common language. The real breakthrough came a week later, when Amara got sick with a stomach bug and Elias had to miss a shift. He was in a bind, unable to afford to miss another day, but with no one to watch his daughter. Desperate, he called the only other person he could think of who had shown him a sliver of kindness. He called Naima, not to ask for help, but to apologize for canceling a tentative coffee date they had planned. "I have to stay with Amara," he explained. "She's not feeling well." "I'll come over," Naima said, a decision that made no logical sense. She canceled 3 meetings, including one with a key investor. She drove her sleek black car from the gleaming towers of Uptown to his quiet, tree-lined street. When she knocked on the door of his apartment, she felt a nervousness she hadn't felt since her first big presentation. The apartment was small, but it was immaculate and filled with a warmth that her own penthouse utterly lacked. The air smelled of ginger tea and disinfectant. Elias looked exhausted, his face etched with worry. Amara was asleep on the sofa, curled up under a quilt that was clearly handmade. "You didn't have to come," he said, his voice low. "I wanted to," she replied, and it was the truest thing she had said all week. She stayed for hours. She didn't do anything important. She sat in the worn armchair while he tended to Amara. She watched him soothe his daughter's fevered brow with a cool cloth. He made her a cup of ginger tea, his movements efficient and caring. They spoke in hushed tones, the conversation flowing more easily here, in his space, than it ever had in a fancy restaurant. He told her about Sarah, his late wife, speaking of her with a quiet reverence that held no self-pity, only love. Naima, in turn, found herself telling him about her parents, about the crushing weight of their expectations. She spoke of her loneliness, a confession she had never made to anyone. In this small, love-filled apartment, her corporate armor began to melt away. He wasn't impressed by her title. He didn't care about her stock options. He just saw her, a person. When Amara finally woke up, her fever broken, she looked at Naima with groggy eyes. "The sad queen came back," she whispered, and then she smiled. Their bond grew in these small domestic moments. Naima started visiting regularly. She'd bring groceries and they would cook together in his tiny kitchen. Her first attempt at pancakes was a disaster. She burned them black. Elias and Amara ate them anyway, laughing. For Naima, who had only ever eaten perfectly crafted food, a burnt pancake shared with people who were laughing with her, not at her, was the most delicious meal of her life. One evening, Amara sat at the kitchen table, drawing with the art set Naima had given her. She was humming to herself, a serious look of concentration on her face. After a while, she padded over to Naima and held up a piece of paper. It was a stick figure drawing. On the left was a tall man with short, coily hair. In the middle was a small girl with braids. And on the right, holding the little girl's hand, was a woman in a shiny dress with her natural hair pulled up in a bun. All three figures were colored in with a brown crayon. "It's us," Amara announced proudly. "A family. Papa, me, and you." Naima took the drawing, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes filled with tears. She had been given stock portfolios, company cars, and corner offices, but no one had ever given her a gift like this. A place, a role, a family, drawn in brown crayon. It was the emotional centerpiece of her entire life. She looked over at Elias, who was watching her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes soft. She cried. Not the controlled, silent tears of a CEO in a moment of stress, but the messy, grateful tears of a woman who was finally, after a lifetime of searching, home. Elias didn't say anything. He just came over and placed a warm, calloused hand on her shoulder. The touch was simple, grounding. "You're safe," he whispered. It wasn't a promise of physical safety, but something deeper. You are safe to be yourself here. And in that moment, she knew she was in love. With him, with his daughter. With this beautifully imperfect, wonderfully real life. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony in the very park where they had first met. It was a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the lavish wedding her parents had always envisioned for her. For Naima, it was perfect. The world Naima came from, however, did not easily accept such a simple, human story. To the board of directors at Vance Tech, her marriage was not a romance. It was a risk assessment. The whispers started subtly. They were couched in corporate jargon, concerns about her judgment, her focus, the brand's image. The chief architect of this campaign of doubt was Marcus Thorne, a slick, ambitious board member who had always viewed Naima's success with a thinly veiled envy. Marcus saw Elias as a liability, a working-class man with no connections, no wealth, no power. In his eyes, Elias was a vulnerability, a chink in Naima's armor that could be exploited. He began to subtly undermine her. At meetings, he would make veiled comments. "We need to ensure our leadership is free from external distractions." He commissioned a private investigator digging into Elias's past, looking for any dirt he could find. He found nothing but the quiet, dignified life of a good man who had suffered a tragedy. But the absence of scandal didn't deter Marcus. He would simply create the perception of one. A gossip blog suddenly ran a story, complete with paparazzi photos of Naima and Elias outside his old apartment building. The headline was cruel. "Billionaire CEO's charity case husband." The article painted Elias as a gold digger, a schemer who had trapped a powerful woman. It was a disgusting, classist fabrication, but it had its intended effect. The company's stock dipped slightly. The board called an emergency meeting. Naima was furious, but she projected an icy calm. She defended her husband, her marriage, her private life, with a ferocity that silenced the room. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The pressure was immense. She began working longer hours, fighting to prove that her marriage hadn't made her weak, that her love hadn't compromised her edge. Elias saw the toll it was taking on her. He saw the exhaustion behind her eyes, the tension in her shoulders when she came home late at night. He heard the way her voice grew clipped and professional on late-night calls. And the old fear, the one he thought he had vanquished, began to creep back in. The fear that he was dragging her down, that her bright, brilliant world would eventually be dimmed by his own small one. He saw the gossip blogs. He heard the whispers. He started to believe them. Was he a liability? Was he just a distraction? The insecurity festered, a poison in his mind. He loved Naima with everything he had, but a part of him, a deeply wounded part, still couldn't believe she truly loved him back. Not for who he was. He felt the chasm between their worlds growing, not because of a lack of love, but because of the external forces trying to tear them apart. He needed to know. He needed to be sure that her love was real, that it wasn't just another form of her boundless generosity. And so, in a moment of profound weakness and fear, he devised his foolish, heartbreaking test. He decided to ask for the one thing he had never and would never ask for: money. "My mother," he lied. "She needs $50,000. He needed to see if her love had a price tag. He watched her walk down the hall, her phone in her hand. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart against his ribs. He was a monster. He had taken her perfect, unconditional love and smeared it with his own ugly fear. He braced himself for the sound of her voice, expecting the clipped, dismissive tone she used with underlings. He expected to hear her complaining to a friend, her voice laced with disappointment. He finally showed his true colors. She stepped into the spare room, leaving the door slightly ajar. He couldn't help it. He crept closer, his own home suddenly feeling like a foreign country. He held his breath, listening. Her voice was a whisper, but it was not the whisper of conspiracy or complaint. It was a whisper of pure, unadulterated fury, a lioness protecting her cub. "No, Mother, you don't understand," Naima hissed into the phone. The call was to her own mother, a woman who had already expressed her profound disapproval of the marriage. "I don't care what Marcus said. I don't care what the board thinks, and I certainly don't care about your snide little comments." There was a pause. Elias could picture her mother on the other end, her voice dripping with condescending concern. Naima's whisper grew fiercer, each word a sharpened blade. "His mother needs help, and that is all that matters. 50,000? If she needed 500,000, I would give it to her. Do you know why? Because she is his mother, which makes her my family. Something you know very little about." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't about the money. He had made it about the money, but she had refused. She had made it about family. "He is not a liability," Naima continued, her voice breaking with a raw emotion he had never heard from her before. "He is the kindest, most decent man I have ever met. He is the first person in my entire life who has never asked me for anything. The first person who sees me, not my bank account. He is my husband. His daughter is my daughter. This is my life. This is my family. And I will burn my entire empire to the ground before I let you, or Marcus, or anyone else touch them." She ended the call abruptly. The silence that followed was more profound than the one before. Elias stumbled back to the armchair, his legs weak. He had tested her, and she had not failed. He had. He had failed her. He had doubted the purest thing in his life. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. The next day, Naima walked into the Vance Tech boardroom. She was not wearing her usual armor of a dark, severe suit. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant, cream-colored dress. Her natural hair was not pulled back in its usual tight bun, but flowed softly around her shoulders. She looked serene, radiant. Marcus Thorne started the meeting, launching into a thinly veiled attack on her leadership, citing the recent media distractions. When he was finished, Naima did not rebut his points. She did not defend herself. She simply stood up. "Marcus," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "You are right. I have been distracted." A smug look flickered across Marcus's face. "I have been distracted by stock prices, by quarterly reports, by market share. I have been distracted by the mistaken belief that my value, my worth, is tied to the performance of this company." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the board members. "My marriage is not a liability. It is my greatest asset. My husband has taught me more about value in the last year than I've learned in a lifetime in business. He has taught me that strength is not about being unbreakable. It is about being vulnerable. That wealth is not about what you own. It is about who you love. And that success is not about building an empire. It is about building a home." She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze steady and clear. "You can have the empire," she said softly. "I choose the home." She placed a single sheet of paper on the polished mahogany table. It was her resignation. The room was stunned into silence. She turned and walked out, leaving the world of glass and steel behind her without a single look back. She was no longer a sad queen. She was just Naima, and she was finally free. That evening, the apartment was quiet. Amara was asleep, her little chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Naima was sitting on the sofa, nursing a cup of tea, the drawing Amara had made for her lying on the coffee table. When Elias came and sat beside her, the space between them felt like a mile-wide canyon. He couldn't look at her. The shame was too great. He stared at his hands, the hands that had built and repaired things, the hands that had held his daughter, the hands that had almost destroyed his own happiness. "Naima," he started, his voice thick. I have to tell you something." "I know," she said softly. He looked up surprised. "You know?" "I heard you in the hall," she said. There was no anger in her voice, only a deep, profound sadness. "Elias, why?" The question hung in the air. He finally let the ugly truth spill out. He told her about his fear, his insecurity, the whispers of the world that had seeped into his head and poisoned his heart. He told her he felt unworthy of her, that he was terrified of being the anchor that pulled her down. As he spoke, the tears he had held back for so long began to fall. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was a fool. I broke your trust." Naima put her teacup down and turned to face him. She took his large, calloused hands in her own. Her touch was warm, certain. "Look at me, Elias." He forced himself to meet her gaze. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only love. A love so deep and so resilient, it humbled him to his very core. "You didn't break my trust," she said. "You tested it, and it held. Because it's real." She squeezed his hands. "Do you know what I did today? I resigned." Elias's eyes widened in shock. "What? Naima, no! Because of me? Because of this?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "Because of me. You and Amara didn't pull me down. You lifted me up. You showed me what was real. I was living in a cage, Elias. A beautiful, gilded cage. You gave me the key. I just had to be brave enough to use it." She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "We're a team," she whispered. "You, me, and Amara. No more tests, no more fear. Just us." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her hair. He was home. He was truly home. A few moments later, a small voice piped up from the doorway. "Are you guys having a sad hug or a happy hug?" They both looked up. Amara was standing there clutching her favorite stuffed giraffe, her eyes wide. Naima smiled, her face wet with tears, but her eyes shining. She opened one arm, beckoning the little girl over. "The happiest hug, sweetie," she said. Amara scurried over and squeezed in between them, a small, warm presence that completed their circle. She looked up at Naima, her expression serious. "Does this mean you're staying forever now?" she asked, the question a perfect echo of the one in Elias's own heart. Naima looked from Amara's hopeful face to Elias's searching one. "Yes," she said, her voice full of a certainty that resonated deep in her soul. "It means I'm staying forever." 3 months later, the late afternoon sun spilled through the windows of a small house with a sprawling, slightly overgrown garden. The house was not a mansion, not a penthouse, but it had something neither of those places had ever possessed: the unmistakable feeling of a home. Naima had not, in the end, left her company entirely. After the shock of her resignation, the board had panicked. They had pleaded with her to stay, offering her anything she wanted. She had agreed, but on her own terms. She became the chairwoman of the board, working remotely, setting her own hours. She had kept the power, but shed the cage. Elias had started his own custom carpentry business, working from a workshop in their new garage. He was building things with his hands, creating beauty from raw wood. His days filled with purpose and the scent of sawdust. On this particular evening, the three of them were in the garden. Elias was patiently showing Amara how to plant marigold seeds in a small patch of earth that was designated as her own. Naima sat on the back porch steps, a book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She was watching them, watching her family. Amara, her hands covered in dirt, held up a wiggling earthworm. "Look, Mama Naima!" she squealed with delight. The name had come naturally one day, a simple, beautiful fusion, and it had stuck. Naima smiled. "He's a handsome fellow, sweetie." The scene was so simple. A man, a woman, and a child in a garden at sunset. But for Naima, it was everything. It was the answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. Later, after Amara was tucked into bed, Elias came to sit beside her on the porch steps. He handed her a mug of her favorite ginger tea. For a long time, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of the crickets starting their evening song. "I love you," Elias said quietly, breaking the silence. It wasn't a desperate confession or a fearful reassurance. It was a simple statement of fact, as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. "I love you too," Naima replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a small, smooth stone he had found in the garden. He placed it in her palm. "I know we're already married," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but I want to ask again, not out of fear, but out of certainty. Will you keep building this life with me?" Naima closed her hand around the stone, its warmth seeping into her skin. She didn't need a diamond. She had this man, this child, this love, this home. "Always," she whispered. And as the last rays of the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, the narrator's voice seemed to settle over the scene like a warm blanket. Love is not found in grand gestures or in the absence of fear. It is forged in the quiet moments, in the courage to choose vulnerability over armor, and in the profound grace of a second chance. Family is not about perfection. It is about presence. It is about burnt pancakes and cartoon bandages, about whispered promises on a back porch. The greatest fortune in the world is not to be wealthy or powerful, but to be truly, completely seen for who you are, and to choose every single day to stay.